In 1948, the world was rebuilding, but in a quiet corner of Greenland, a Danish archaeologist was looking back. Christian Leif Vibach was carefully excavating the ruins of a Benedictine convent in the Unartok Fjord. The site dated to the Viking Age, a small Norse settlement that had clung to life on the edge of the known world around 1000 AD. The work was slow. Sieves sifted through centuries of soil and collapsed turf walls. Most finds were what you might expect. Bone fragments, broken pottery, rusted iron nails. Then one of the workers handed Vibach a piece of wood. It was a fragment of a disc about 70 millimeters across. It was not ornate or special at first glance. It looked like the bottom of a small bowl or a lid, but it had strange lines carved into its surface. A central pinhole was surrounded by a series of radiating lines and a distinct notch on the rim. Vibach didn't know what it was. For years, it sat in a museum collection in Copenhagen, catalogued as a decorative object of unknown purpose. Nobody paid it much attention. It was just another piece of Viking Age wood. Decades later, scholars revisited the object. They looked at the precise mnemonic lines, the central hole for a shadow pin, the notch. They compared it to old Icelandic sagas that spoke of a solar board, a sun board. It became clear what Vibach had found. It was not a decoration, it was a tool. A piece of high technology from a time before compasses. The Unartok disc was a sun compass. By placing a pin in the center, a Viking navigator could watch the shadow it cast. At midday, when the shadow was shortest, it pointed directly south in the northern hemisphere. This gave them a true north-south line. The carved lines could then be used to track the sun's path across the sky, allowing them to hold a steady course even when the sun was low on the horizon, in the early morning or late afternoon. It was a simple, ingenious device that provided a fixed reference point in a world of endless, shifting water. The small wooden fragment from a forgotten convent ruin was physical proof of how Norse seafarers tamed the North Atlantic. It was one tool in a large and varied kit, a collection of skills and knowledge that allowed them to cross vast stretches of open ocean when other European sailors were still nervously hugging the coast. They did not have one secret, they had many. Number 19, the sky betrays the ice. Gunnar Hrolfsson stood at the steering oar of the Sea Stallion in the summer of 986 AD. He was not a young man. His beard was more white than red, and the skin around his eyes was a permanent web of lines from squinting at the sun and sea. For 3 days, they had seen nothing but gray water and gray sky. They were following the route Eric the Red had charted just a few years earlier, a risky voyage from Iceland to the new green land he promised. But Eric had not mentioned the ice, or maybe he had, and Gunnar's Jarl had simply not listened. Now they were in it. The temperature had dropped sharply, the air had a clean, cold bite that felt different from the usual sea air. Small chunks of ice growlers scraped against the wooden hull with a sickening groan. Ahead, a vast field of pack ice blocked their path westward. To the north and south, it stretched as far as the eye could see, a white desert on the water. The crew was silent and afraid. Turning back to Iceland was an option, but it meant failure. It meant admitting defeat to the sea. Pushing forward seemed impossible. They could be crushed in hours if the ice shifted. Gunnar did not look at the ice. He looked at the clouds. The sky was a low, uniform sheet of gray, but it was not entirely uniform. Directly ahead, above the endless field of white, the underside of the clouds glowed with a faint, eerie brightness. It was a pale, flat light, a phenomenon sailors called ice blink. The vast expanse of ice was acting like a giant mirror, reflecting what little light there was up onto the cloud base. It was a warning sign, a massive celestial billboard that read ice below. Gunnar scanned the horizon. He let his eyes move north along the edge of the ice field. He was looking for its opposite, and then he saw it. It's a dark patch on the underside of the clouds. It was not black, but a distinct, dull, gray blue, almost like a bruise on the sky. The old hands knew this sign too. It was water sky. Open water does not reflect light like ice does. It absorbs it. That dark patch meant a lead, a channel of clear water was somewhere below it. It might be miles away, but it was there. Steer north, Gunnar said, his voice a low rumble. Towered the dark sky. The Jarl, a young man named Bjarni, looked at him with uncertainty. North. That takes us away from the route. The route is blocked, Gunnar replied without looking at him. His eyes were fixed on that distant, dark patch of cloud. The sky tells us where the water is. We follow the water. It took them half a day of careful sailing along the edge of the ice pack. The air was frigid. Men wrapped themselves in wool and seal hides, their breath misting in front of their faces. The groaning of the ice was a constant companion, but Gunnar's confidence never wavered. He kept the sea stallion pointed toward the water sky. Slowly, the dark patch on the clouds grew larger, more defined, and then, in the late afternoon, they saw it. A channel of deep blue water opened up in the ice, a river through a frozen continent. It was wide enough for their Nair to pass through safely. Gunnar had used the sky itself as a map. He had navigated not by what he could see on the water, but by the reflection of the world on the low-hanging canvas of the clouds. This was a skill learned at the edge of the world, a deep understanding of light and ice born from necessity. They sailed through the channel, and 2 days later, they saw the green shores of Eric's new land. The crew looked at Gunnar with a new respect, for he hadn't just saved their ship, he had read a language in the sky that none of the younger men even knew existed. Number 18, The Sea Has a Pulse. Astrid was only 17 in the spring of 875 AD, but she knew the sea better than most men, twice her age. Her father, Olaf, was the captain of the Wave Dancer, a trading vessel that plied the waters between Rogaland in Norway and the Northern Isles. This trip had been different. A late winter storm had caught them off the coast of the Shetlands, blowing them far south of their intended port. For 2 days, they fought the wind and waves, losing one of their sail yards and half their water barrels. Now the storm had passed, but they were lost, with a battered ship and a tired crew. When they finally sighted land, it was a welcome sight. A series of steep green cliffs with a narrow inlet that promised a safe harbor. But as they drew closer, Olaf's face grew grim. The water at the mouth of the inlet was a churning chaos. A fierce current was pouring out, clashing with the incoming ocean swell to create a standing wave, a dangerous tidal race the locals called a roost. To try and enter now would be suicide. The current would either smash them against the rocks or sweep them back out to sea. "We wait," Olaf declared, his voice heavy with fatigue. "We'll anchor here and wait for the tide to turn." The older sailors nodded in agreement, but Astrid was watching the water with a focused intensity. She had been to these islands once before, a few years ago. She had sat with an old fisherman who had drawn maps in the sand for her, explaining the strange and powerful tides that governed these waters. He had told her that the roost was not constant, it was tied to the moon, to the great pulse of the ocean. It was strongest when the tide was running its fastest, either in or out. But for a brief period, at the very peak of high tide and the very bottom of low tide, there was a moment of calm. All slack water, the old man had called it. A brief pause in the sea's breathing. She walked to her father. "We don't have to wait for the whole tide," she said, her voice clear and steady. "The slack is coming soon." Olaf looked at his daughter. He trusted her instincts, but this was a huge risk. The crew was murmuring, anxious to get to shore, but terrified of the churning water ahead. "How do you know?" he asked. I watched the moon last night," she explained. "It's nearing its quarter. The tides are weaker now. And look at the seaweed on the rocks." She pointed to the shore. "The water is as high as it will go. The flow should stop any minute." She had been observing the small details. The way the floating debris on the water's surface had started to drift in lazy circles instead of being swept out to sea. The way the roar of the roost had subtly softened. These were the signs. The sea was about to hold its breath. Her father looked from the churning water to his daughter's confident face. He saw the knowledge in her eyes. It was not a guess, it was a calculation, a deep, intuitive understanding of the rhythm of the ocean. He made a decision. Raise the anchor, he bellowed. Man the oars! We go on the girl's word. There were nervous glances, but the crew obeyed. They rowed with all their strength, pulling the wave dancer toward the mouth of the inlet. For a few terrifying moments, the current still tugged at them, trying to spin the ship. But Astrid was right. The power was gone from the water. The roost had subsided into a series of harmless eddies. They slipped through the narrow entrance and into the calm, deep water of the harbor. They had used their knowledge of the ocean's pulse, its powerful tides and hidden currents, as a key to unlock a safe passage. It was a form of navigation that had nothing to do with the sky and everything to do with feeling the very heartbeat of the sea. Number 17, the land has a taste and a texture. The fog was a cold, wet blanket. It had rolled in during the night, thick and disorienting. Kettle, the navigator of the longship Iron Boar, could not see the bow of his own ship from the stern. They had been sailing for a week from Hedeby, aiming for the coast of Francia to trade furs for wine. According to his dead reckoning, they should be close to the shallow, sandy coastline of Jutland. But in this fog, close was a deadly word. Run aground on a sandbar, and the ship would be lost. The year was 911 AD. The crew was on edge. The silence of the fog was unnerving, broken only by the drip of water from the sail and the cry of a distant gull they could not see. The Jarl, a young man named Rolf, was impatient. Where is the land, old man?" he asked Kettle. Kettle did not answer immediately. He walked to the bow where a sailor stood holding a long line of plated leather. At the end of the line was a heavy piece of lead, about the size of a man's fist. The bottom of the lead was hollowed out and filled with hard tallow. This was their sounding lead, a simple tool, but in these conditions it was their eyes. Let it down, Kettle ordered. The sailor dropped the lead into the gray water, the line uncoiled rapidly, marked with colored strips of cloth every few fathoms. He let it run until he felt the lead hit the bottom. He pinched the line at the water's surface and hauled it back in. 15 fathoms, the sailor announced. Kettil nodded. That was good. Still in deep enough water, but that was only half the information. He took the lead weight and looked at the tallow in its base. It was clean, he grunted. Mud. We are still over the deep channel. He knew this coast not as a line on a map, but as a three-dimensional landscape under the water. He had memorized its texture. He knew that the deep channel leading to the river mouth had a soft, muddy bottom. The treacherous sandbars that flanked it were made of coarse, gray sand. And the shoreline itself was littered with small pebbles and crushed shells. The sounding lead was not just measuring depth, it was tasting the seabed. We go east for an hour, Ketel said. Then we sound again. They rowed slowly, cautiously through the blind world of the fog. An hour later, the call came again. Sounding. The lead went down. The sailor pulled it up. 12 fathoms. Adkatil took the weight. This time the tallow was not clean. It was coated with fine gray sand. A few tiny shell fragments were embedded in it. And Ketil smelled the tallow. He even touched a grain of the sand to his tongue. It was a habit from his youth, a way to connect with the land. "A sand," he announced. "We are over the bar. The river mouth is to the north. Turn us, slowly." He had them sound every 10 minutes. Each time the depth decreased, 10 fathoms, 8 fathoms. But the sample on the tallow remained consistent gray sand. They were following the sandbar, staying just off it in the deeper water of the channel. Then the sample changed. The tallow came up with a mix of sand and small, smooth pebbles. "The shore," Kettle whispered. "Row easy." A few minutes later, a dark shape loomed out of the fog. It was the low, grassy bank of the river estuary. They had found their way through the fog and the treacherous shallows, not with their eyes, but with their sense of touch. And Ketil had painted a picture of the unseen world below them, one sounding at a time. He used depth, texture, and taste to create a mental map, proving that a Viking navigator's knowledge did not stop at the water's surface, but went all the way to the ocean floor. Number 16, the coast is a story you memorize. Leif was on his first major voyage in the summer of 1001 AD. He was a young man, eager to prove himself. But he was not the Leif who would later sail to Vinland. This was Leif Thorvaldsson, a distant cousin of the famous explorer, and his journey was more modest. He was tasked with taking a nar loaded with walrus ivory from the Greenland settlement down to Iceland and then on to Norway. The first leg of the journey across the Denmark Strait to the western fjords of Iceland was the most dangerous, or open ocean, but his teacher, an old navigator named Finn, had a different approach. He did not believe in striking out directly across the open water. That was a game for fools and lucky men. The sea is featureless, Finn had told him before they left. But the land always tells a story. You just have to learn how to read it. Finn's method was coastal piloting, but raised to an art form. For the first part of their journey, they did not leave sight of the Greenlandic coast. They hugged the shore, sailing south from the eastern settlement. Every day was a lesson for Leif. Finn would point out features on the land. See that mountain, he would say. The one shaped like a sleeping giant. When that is directly behind your right shoulder, you are past the treacherous currents of the southern cape. Remember it. Another day, he would point to a specific glacier. That one has 3 dark stripes of rock in it. We call it the Clawed Glacier. When it is abeam of us, there is a good freshwater stream just inland if we need it. He taught Leif to see the coast not as an undifferentiated mass of rock and ice, but as a sequence of unique landmarks. A oddly shaped sea stack, a waterfall that was visible for miles, a fjord with a distinctively wide mouth. It was a mental map, a saga told in stone and water. He had them sail close enough to see the details, but far enough out to avoid hidden rocks. When they reached the southernmost point of Greenland, it was time to make the jump across the strait. This was the moment of open water sailing. But Finn's preparation had not been about the ocean, it had been about the departure and arrival points. We leave from the cape with the twin peaks, Finn instructed. We sail with the morning sun at our backs, just over the left steering oar. We hold that course for 2 days. If the weather is clear, you will see the Snæfellsjökull Glacier in Iceland. It is a mountain of ice so tall you can see it when you are still a day's sail away. It will be your guide. He had not given Leif a direction like east. He had given him a set of visual instructions. Depart from this specific place, point your ship in relation to the sun in this specific way, and look for that specific landmark. It was a system built on memorization and observation. The entire voyage was a story. It started with the Sleeping Giant Mountain, continued past the Clawed Glacier, and launched from the Twin Peaks. The climax of the story was the first glimpse of the ice-capped volcano in Iceland. During the crossing, the weather turned. Clouds obscured the sun. Leif felt a knot of panic in his stomach, but Finn was calm. He watched the swell of the waves and kept the wind consistent on his cheek. He was holding the course from memory. And on the third morning, the clouds broke. Directly ahead, glowing in the morning light, was the unmistakable white peak of Snæfellsjökull, exactly where Finn had said it would be. Leif finally understood. The open sea was just a blank chapter. The real story, the one that got you safely from one place to another, was written on the land. A skilled navigator did not just sail his ship. He recited the coast. He knew its verses and choruses by heart. Number 15, the straight line is a lie. Ragnar the Trader was a man of logic. He liked things to be neat and predictable. In the year 950 AD, he was captain of his own ship, the Prophet, a broad-beamed nar designed for cargo, not for war. His goal was to establish the most efficient trade route possible between Kaupang in Norway and Jorvik in England. Other traders followed the coastline, a long and time-consuming route. Ragnar wanted to cut straight across the North Sea. A straight line, he reasoned, was the shortest path. He had a simple but, he thought, brilliant idea. He would use the sun. He knew that at midday the sun was at its highest point in the south, So if he kept the midday sun directly behind him, he should be sailing due to north. Like, if he kept it directly in front of him, he was sailing south. By keeping it at a constant angle to his ship throughout the day, say, always off his right side, he should be sailing a straight line east. He was attempting to sail a rum line, or a loxodrome, a course of constant bearing. He set out from Kaupang on a clear summer morning. He noted the position of the rising sun and made a mark on the ship's rail. His plan was to keep the sun at that same relative angle all day. As the sun moved across the sky, he would adjust the ship's course to match. In his mind, he was drawing a perfectly straight line on the surface of the ocean. For the first day, it seemed to work. The weather was fair, the wind was steady, and he felt a smug satisfaction in his cleverness. But on the second day, a low cloud cover rolled in. He could no longer see the sun. He did his best to hold the course using the wind and the waves, but he knew he was drifting. When the sun finally reappeared on the third day, he was dismayed. He took his bearings again and realized he was much farther south than he should have been. He had not accounted for the ocean currents, nor for the sideways drift caused by the wind. He corrected his course, once again pointing the ship to keep the sun at his desired angle. He sailed for 2 more days. When he finally made landfall, he was not at Jorvik. He was nearly 100 miles to the north on the wild coast of what would one day be Scotland. He had missed his target completely. Disheartened, he found a small Norse settlement and spoke to an old fisherman. He explained his logical method. The old man listened patiently, chewing on a piece of dried fish. "You think the sea is a floor," the old man said when Ragnar had finished. You think you can draw a straight line on it. But the sea is alive. It moves. And your line is not straight." The fisherman explained, "The sun's path across the sky changes with the seasons. A constant angle to the sun does not produce a straight line on the Earth's curved surface. It produces a spiral. And more importantly, the ship itself is not a point on a map. It is pushed by wind and water. You cannot simply point it and forget it. You must constantly adjust, constantly read the signs. You sail from here to there," the old man said, pointing with his fish. "You do not look at your boat. You look at there. You know what the coast of Jorvik looks like. You know the birds that fly from it. You know the color of the water. You sail toward that knowledge. Your straight line is a lie. The true path is a living, crooked thing you find every day." Your Ragnar learned a hard lesson. Viking navigation was not about imposing a rigid, logical system onto the ocean. Well, it was not geometry. It was a conversation. It was a process of constant observation and correction. You had to account for the drift, the currents, the changing winds. You had to aim for a destination and use all your senses to feel your way toward it. His attempt to sail a perfect rum line had failed because he had forgotten that the ocean did not care for his straight lines. It had its own paths, and a good navigator had to learn to follow them. Number 14, the mind is the best map. Ivar the Boneless was known as a great warrior, a son of the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok. But the stories of the great heathen army's invasion of England in 865 AD often overlook the incredible logistical feat behind it. Hundreds of ships, thousands of men sailing from Denmark and Norway to a specific landing point in East Anglia. This was not a random beaching, it was a planned invasion, and the plan relied on something invisible memory. The navigator of Ivar's lead ship was a man named Tosti, a man whose head held a library of sea lanes. Tosti could not read or write. There were no paper charts in his sea chest. The charts were in his mind, etched there by years of experience and, more importantly, by the stories and verses he had learned as a boy. Viking navigation was a deeply oral tradition. The directions from one place to another were not written down, they were encoded in sagas, poems, and simple rhythmic instructions. Before the fleet left, Tosti would have sat with the other lead navigators chanting the directions. It would have sounded like a prayer or a poem. From the Ska, one day's sail west to the Doggerbank, where the water is shallow and the cod are thick. Then south, southwest for 2 days with the wind on your port quarter. You will smell the salt marsh of the Wash before you see the low shore. Beware the hidden sands. Follow the gulls inland to the river mouth. These were not just directions, they were a multi-sensory guide. They included duration, 1 day's sail, a rough measure of about 150 miles in good conditions, landmarks, the Dogger Bank, a well-known fishing ground, wind direction, and even smells. The instruction to follow the gulls inland was a precise piece of local knowledge, telling captains that the gulls would show them the safe channel up the river. As they sailed, Tosti would be constantly reciting the voyage in his head. He was not just steering, he was living out a story he already knew by heart. When a young sailor asked how he knew where they were, Tosti would point to the color of the water. "Too green," he might say. "The Dogger Bank water is a milky blue-gray. We have drifted south. Steer us more to the west." His mind held dozens of these oral charts. The route to Ireland with its landmark of the Twin Mountains on the Isle of Man, the route to Frisia, which required careful navigation through the coastal islands, the dangerous northern route to the land of the Finns, which was described in terms of sailing past the edge of the world's sight. These mental maps were incredibly detailed and robust. They were passed down from master to apprentice, often in the form of kennings and poetic verses that made them easier to remember. A dangerous whirlpool might be called the sea wolf's maw. A reef might be the shipbreaker. This was not just for dramatic effect. It made the information sticky, memorable. When the great heathen army's fleet finally appeared off the coast of East Anglia, it was not by accident. It was the result of 1,000 minds holding a single memorized map. Tosti had not needed ink or parchment. His experience, woven into the fabric of story and verse, was more reliable. He had navigated the most complex naval invasion of his time using the most powerful tool available to any Viking sailor, a well-trained and knowledgeable mind. This was the true secret of their reach. Their maps were not on paper, they were in the people. Number 13, the sea changes its taste. Sigurd was nervous. It was his first time as the lead navigator on a journey to Dublin, the rich trading town the Norse had established in Ireland. The year was 920 AD. The trip from the Isle of Man was short, but notorious for its tricky currents and foggy weather. For the last day, a thick sea mist had clung to them, reducing visibility to a few ship lengths. They had been sailing west, using the wind and the swell, but Sigurd knew they could have been pushed north or south. He needed to find the mouth of the River Liffey, the gateway to Dublin. They could hear land. The sound of waves breaking on a shore was a dull roar somewhere in the mist ahead. But was it a rocky cliff or a sandy beach? Was it the right bay or a dangerous trap? An old sailor named Coley came to stand beside him. "The sea will tell us," Coley said, and he lowered a wooden bucket over the side, pulling up a sample of the gray water. He dipped a finger in and touched it to his tongue. He swished it around in his mouth like a wine connoisseur. He spit it out. "Pure salt. We are still in the open sea. Keep going." Sigurd was skeptical. How could the taste of the water help? Coley explained as they sailed slowly forward. "Every great river pushes a plume of fresh water far out into the sea. The Liffey is a big river. It fights the salt. As we get closer to its mouth, the sea will become less salty. It will taste different. It will feel different." It was a technique learned from generations of coastal sailing. In a landscape often obscured by fog and rain, the Vikings learned to use their other senses. They listened for the sound of seabirds nesting on cliffs. They smelled the scent of wood smoke or damp earth. And they tasted the water. They sounded their horn every few minutes, listening for an echo that would warn of cliffs. The dull roar of the surf grew louder. After another hour of cautious rowing, Coley took another sample. He tasted it again. A slow smile spread across his weathered face. "There," he said. "It has changed. It's brackish." The salt has a green, muddy taste to it now. The river is close, and it is to our left. "How do you know which side?" Sigurd asked. "The taste is stronger on the port side," Coley replied. He had taken small samples from both sides of the ship. "The current is carrying the fresh water this way. The river mouth is over there." He pointed into the white void. Following the old man's advice, Sigurd turned the ship. They continued on, tasting the water every 10 minutes. Each sample was less salty than the last. The green taste of river water, of soil and vegetation washed down from the Irish hills became more pronounced. Then through a thinning patch of mist they saw it, a low sandy spit of land, and beyond it the wide calm expanse of the river estuary. Moored along the bank were the familiar shapes of other Norse longships and trading knars they had found Dublin, and Sigurd had learned a vital lesson. The line between sea and land was not always a visual one. It was a gradient, a place where two worlds mixed. And a good navigator could read that transition not with his eyes, but with his tongue. He had found a major harbor in a complete whiteout by tasting the subtle dilution of the ocean. Number 12, the land breathes. Astrid, the same woman who had navigated the Shetland Roost as a girl, was now a mature and respected navigator in her own right. It was the autumn of 890 AD, and she was guiding her family's ship back to their home in western Norway after a trading voyage to Iceland. The final leg of the journey was always the hardest. The Norwegian coast was a maze of islands and fjords, and a common tactic was to aim for a known landmark, a large island like Hålogaland, and then work their way in. They had been at sea for several days, and by her reckoning, they were close. But the sky was a featureless gray, and a persistent haze sat on the horizon, obscuring any distant view. There was no sun to take a bearing from, no stars. The wind had been shifty. She was relying on the steady, deep swell from the west to keep her general direction, but she needed to find land, and soon. A storm was brewing. She stood at the bow, ignoring the anxious chatter of the crew. She was not looking. She was smelling. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, then another. The air mostly smelled of salt and wet wool. But underneath it, she could just barely detect something else, a faint, earthy scent, the smell of damp soil and decaying leaves, the smell of a forest after rain. Land, she said quietly. Her father, Olaf, now an old man who let his daughter command the ship's course, came to her side. You are sure? Yes. The wind is coming from the east, off the land. It carries the smell. It's faint, but it's there. This was a core part of the navigator's sensory toolkit. Land has a distinct smell, and in the right conditions, that smell can travel for many miles over the open ocean. The scent of pine forests, especially after rain, was a well-known sign. The smell of burning peat from a coastal farm could be a welcome guide. In the spring, the scent of flowering grasslands could betray an island's location. Astrid held her course, sailing into the wind, toward the source of the smell. An hour passed. The scent grew stronger. It was no longer just a hint of damp earth. Now she could distinguish the sharp, clean fragrance of pine. Then a sailor shouted, "Smoke!" He was pointing to a low smudge against the gray sky. It was not a cloud. It was the smoke from a cooking fire or a smithy's forge in a coastal village. The smell had guided them close enough for a visual confirmation. First the nose, then the eyes. As they drew closer, the land itself finally emerged from the haze, a long, dark line of pine-covered hills rising from the sea. They had found the coast. Astrid had navigated them home not with a compass or a sunstone or the stars, but with her nose. She had followed a ghost on the wind, the very breath of her homeland, breathing out across the water to welcome them. It was a reminder that the Viking navigator was not a scientist with instruments, but a naturalist who was deeply in tune with the world, using every sense to find their way. Number 11, the land wears a crown of clouds. Bjorn Grimson was considered reckless by some. He preferred to sail fast and take chances. In 995 AD, he was racing a rival merchant to Trondheim, both laden with furs from the north. A storm had separated them, and Bjorn had pushed the sea serpent hard, taking a route further out to sea to catch a stronger wind. Now the wind had died, and he was becalmed under a hot sun, with no idea how far he had drifted. He only knew the coast was to the east. But where? He scanned the empty horizon. Nothing. Just the endless blue of the sea meeting the endless blue of the sky. But Bjorn was not looking at the horizon, he was looking up, High above the horizon, in the direction he believed the land to be, was a small, puffy line of cumulus clouds. The rest of the sky was perfectly clear. Oars out, he commanded. Row east, toward those clouds. A young crewman, new to the sea, asked, "Why there?" "They are just clouds." Bjorn grinned. "Not just clouds, boy. Those are land clouds." He had learned this from an old Finn trader. Land and sea absorb and reflect the sun's heat differently. On a clear, warm day, the land heats up faster than the water. This warm air over the land rises. As it rises, it cools, and the moisture in it condenses to form clouds. The sea, being cooler, does not generate these same thermal updrafts. The result is a line of clouds that forms directly over the coastline, a cloud street that perfectly maps the shape of the land below, even when the land itself is too far away to be seen. They rowed for hours. The sun beat down on their backs. The small line of clouds on the horizon did not seem to get any closer. The young sailor was beginning to think Bjorn was chasing a phantom, but the old navigator never took his eyes off them. He knew the clouds were his signpost. In the late afternoon, they saw it. A dark line appeared on the horizon directly beneath the row of white clouds. And it was the coast, the mountains of Norway. The clouds had been a perfect marker, a crown resting on the head of the unseen land. Bjorn had used his understanding of how land and weather interact. He knew that the land itself would create a signal in the sky. This was especially useful in the flat, low-lying coasts of Denmark or England, where you could be very close to shore without being able to see it. But the clouds would give it away. They were a sign that the featureless expanse of water was about to end. It was another example of the Vikings reading the world around them, finding navigational clues not just in the predictable movements of the sun and stars, but in the fleeting, ephemeral patterns of the weather itself. Bjorn won his race to Trondheim. His rival, who did not know the secret of the land clouds, was still searching for the coast a day later. Number 10, the color of the sea tells a story. The journey from Iceland to Greenland was a notorious one. Eric the Red had made it famous, but that did not make it easy. In the summer of 1005 AD, a young navigator named Steinthor was guiding a ship of settlers. It was his first time in command. The voyage had gone well until the last few days. Persistent fog had made sun sightings impossible, and he was worried. They were in the dangerous waters off Greenland's eastern coast, a place of icebergs and strong, unpredictable currents. He was using a sounding lead to check the depth, which told him they were on the continental shelf, but that was a vast area. He needed to find the specific fjord that led to the settlement, but in the gray fog, every direction looked the same. The mood on the ship was grim. Supplies were running low. Steinthor remembered the words of an old Greenland sailor. "The sea has more colors than a jarl's cloak," the man had said. "You must learn to read them all." He ordered the rowers to stop. He had the crew lower buckets on ropes from the bow, the stern, the port, and the starboard sides, all at the same time. They hauled the buckets up and placed them on the deck. Steinthor walked from one to the other, peering intently into the water each contained. The water from the stern, from the direction they had come, was a deep, dark blue-black, the color of the deep, cold North Atlantic. The water from the port and starboard buckets was much the same, but the water from the bow bucket, from the direction they were heading, was different. It had a distinct greenish-gray tint, and when he ran his fingers through it, he could feel a fine, almost imperceptible grit. "Glacial melt," he said, to no one in particular. He had found his clue. The great ice sheets that covered Greenland were constantly grinding the rock beneath them into a fine powder known as glacial flour. The rivers of meltwater running from beneath the glaciers carry this flour out to sea. This suspended sediment changes the color of the water, turning it from deep blue to a murky, opaque green or gray. Each major fjord system had its own plume of meltwater, its own signature color. "The water is greenest to the north," he announced to the crew after taking more samples. The current is carrying the silt from that direction. The mouth of Eric's fjord must be just north of us. He gave the order to, turn the ship and row slowly north, parallel to the unseen coast. Every half hour they would stop and sample the water. As they moved north, the water in the buckets became progressively greener, more clouded with the fine powder from the ice cap. He was using the color of the water as a guide, following the trail of silt like a hunter tracking an animal. After several hours, the fog began to thin. A vast, dark shape emerged from the mist, a towering cliff of black rock, its peak lost in the clouds, and beside it a wide opening in the coastline from which a visibly greener current was flowing into the sea. They had found the fjord. Steinthor had navigated not by sight, but by hue. He had read the subtle shifts in the water's color to find a single entrance in a 1,000-mile coastline. He understood that the land reached out into the sea, changing its very nature, and that a navigator who knew how to look could see that change long before he saw the land itself. Number 9, The Wind Whispers the Way. The voyage was a failure. Thorfinn Karlsefni's attempt to establish a permanent colony in Vinland, the land Leif Erikson had discovered, had ended in conflict with the native Skrælings. In the autumn of 1013 AD, they were retreating, a small fleet of 3 ships heading back to Greenland. A fierce storm in the Labrador Sea had scattered them. Karlsefni's ship, the Fjord Elk, was now alone, its sail torn, its crew exhausted, and they were lost. For days, the sky had been a turmoil of gray cloud. The captain was a veteran sailor named Snorri, a man who prided himself on his skill. But this time he was truly disoriented. The storm had spun them around. He had no idea which way was east. To sail west or south meant certain death in the vast, unknown wilderness of Vinland. To sail north meant the ice of the Arctic. They had to go east, but which way was east? The sea was a confused jumble of waves, the aftermath of the storm offering no clues. Snorri stood on the deck, his face to the wind, his eyes closed. The wind was still strong, blowing cold and steady. But what direction was it coming from? Without a sun or stars as a reference, it was just wind. "Bring me the old man," Snorri growled. The crew brought forward a very old man named Brand. He had been a sailor his entire life, but was now mostly blind, his eyes clouded over with a pale film. He did nothing on the ship but mend nets and tell stories. The crew looked on, confused. What could a blind old man do? Snorri led Brand to the side of the ship. "Brand," he said respectfully, "we are lost. The storm has taken our bearings. I need to find east." Brand did not answer. He simply lifted his face, his sightless eyes toward the sky. He turned his head slowly from side to side, letting the wind blow across his face. He licked his lips. He sniffed the air. He stood like that for a long time, a living weather vane, while the ship rose and fell on the waves. The crew watched in silence. It seemed like madness. Finally, Brand spoke, his voice a dry rasp. "This is not the sea wind," he said. "The sea wind, the west wind, is wet and heavy with salt. You can feel the spray in it even on a dry day. This wind is thin, and dry, and cold. It tastes of stone and ice. This is a land wind. It is coming off a great, cold land to the north." He was using a lifetime of sensory experience. He knew the distinct character of the winds from different directions. The west wind from the open Atlantic felt and tasted different from the north wind that blew down from the Arctic ice, which was different again from the east wind that came from Europe. "The wind is on my left cheek now," Brand continued. "It comes from the north. So, if I face the wind..." He turned his frail body slowly until the wind was directly in his face. "Then east is to my right hand." He lifted his right arm and pointed out into the gray emptiness. "That way is Greenland." Snorri stared at the old man, then out of the direction he was pointing. It was a course based on nothing more than the feel and taste of the wind on an old man's skin, but Snorri trusted him. Brand had spent 80 years learning the personality of the North Atlantic winds. "Steer that way," Snorri commanded. They sailed for 4 days in the direction the blind man had pointed. On the 5th morning, the clouds broke, and they saw the familiar ice blink on the horizon that signaled the coast of Greenland. The old man, with no eyes to see, had shown them the way. He had navigated by using the wind not just as a force to push the sail, but as a source of information, a messenger that carried the scent and feel of the distant lands it had crossed. Number 8. The Ocean's True Grain. Halfdan was a raider. He was a young, ambitious Viking in the year 840 AD, part of a fleet sailing from Denmark to attack the coast of Francia. His ship was fast, and his crew was eager for plunder, but Halfdan was also a student of the sea. While other warriors sharpened their axes, he watched the water. They had been sailing south along the coast, but a thick fog had forced them to pull out into the open sea to avoid running aground. They had been out of sight of land for a day, and the captain was growing concerned. He was steering by the wind, but he wasn't sure if it had shifted during the night. Halfdan lay down on the deck near the stern, his cheek pressed against the wet planks. He closed his eyes. The ship was rolling in a complex motion. There was the short, choppy movement of the local wind waves. But underneath that, Halfdan could feel a deeper, slower rhythm, a long, powerful, and incredibly regular rolling motion. It was the ocean swell. He explained it to a skeptical crewmate. The wind makes these small waves, he said, pointing to the choppy surface. They are new. They are temporary. They follow the wind of today. But the big waves, the deep ones, they are old. The ocean swell is created by powerful storms far out in the open ocean. These long wavelength waves travel for hundreds, even thousands of miles, long after the storm that created them has died. They are a constant, a baseline rhythm of the sea. In the North Atlantic, the prevailing winds and major storm tracks are in the west. This means there is an almost permanent underlying swell that rolls from the west towards the coast of Europe. The wind today is from the north, Halfdan said, sitting up. But the true grain of the sea is from the west. Feel it? The long roll is coming from our starboard side. He could feel the ship being lifted, slowly and powerfully, from the right, and then settling back down. This slow, deep pulse was his compass. As long as he kept that deep swell coming from the same direction, from his right side, he knew he was continuing to sail south. The small, choppy wind waves could be ignored. They were just noise. The swell was the true signal. This was a masterful skill. It required the navigator to filter out the immediate, chaotic information of the local weather and tune into the fundamental, constant energy of the ocean. It was like feeling the pulse of the planet. It was a technique that worked in fog, under clouds, even in the dead of night. And as long as the sea was not perfectly calm, there was a direction embedded in its very movement. Using Halfdan's advice, the captain adjusted his course. He ignored the north wind and steered the ship to keep the great Atlantic swell on his starboard beam. 2 hours later, the fog lifted. They saw the coast of Francia, exactly where they expected it to be. The other warriors were impressed. Halfdan had shown them that the best way to read the ocean was not always to look at its surface, but sometimes to lie down and feel its ancient, steady heart. Number 7, the sky clock and its pointers. It was the dark of the moon in the year 965 AD. A lone longship, the Night Runner, was cutting through the waters between Ireland and Wales. They were on a raid, and, they were using the darkness as their cover, but sailing at night without a moon was a dangerous proposition. The ship's navigator, an Orkney man named Magnus, relied on the stars. Most sailors knew of the North Star, the one star that did not move. But tonight, a low haze on the northern horizon obscured it. Finding north was a problem. Without that fixed point, the whole sky was just a confusing scatter of lights. Magnus, however, was not worried. He knew the sky was not just a collection of points, it was a machine. A great, slow turning clock. He gathered the younger oarsmen who were on watch. "You are looking for one star," he told them. "You should be looking for a story. Look there." He pointed up to a familiar shape. The Great Bear. Or, as we call it, Karlsvang, the man's wagon. He traced the 7 bright stars of the Big Dipper. See the wagon and the 3 horses pulling it. He showed them how the 2 stars at the end of the Wagon's bowl, Merock, and Duba were the key. Hose are the pointers, he said. They always, always point the way. He held up his hand, tracing a straight line from the two stars out into the sky. Follow that line from them, about 5 times the distance that separates them, and you will always find the North Star. Even though the North Star itself was hidden, Magnus knew exactly where it should be. The pointers gave him his bearing. The haze was low enough that the Great Bear was clearly visible above it. He had found north without seeing the North Star itself. But he was not done. "The sky is a clock," he repeated. "The North Star is the pin in the center. The wagon turns around it once every day. By seeing where the wagon is in its journey, I know the time of night." He knew that in the early evening in autumn, the wagon was low in the sky. By midnight, it had moved higher. Before dawn, it was almost directly overhead. By judging its position, he could estimate how many hours of darkness were left. This was crucial for timing a raid or for knowing when to expect the dawn. He also used other constellations. He pointed out a W-shaped group of stars on the other side of the North Star from the Great Bear. "That is the Queen Cassiopeia," he said. "She is always opposite the wagon. If you cannot see one, you can often see the other. She, too, can help you find the north." To Magnus, the night sky was not a mystery. It was a map, a clock, and a calendar all in one. He did not need to see every single piece of it to understand how it worked. By knowing the relationship between the constellations, how they moved in relation to each other and to the fixed point of the north, he could navigate with confidence through the darkest night. He was reading the gears of the celestial machine. The young oarsman looked at the sky with new eyes. It was no longer a random collection of lights, but a coherent story, a guide they could trust. Number 6, the unmoving star. Floki Vilgerdarson was a man of great vision, and according to the sagas, of great sorrows. Around the year 870 AD, before the permanent settlement of Iceland, he set out from Norway to find the land that another sailor, Gardar Svavarsson, had discovered. The Landnámabók, the Icelandic Book of Settlements, tells his story. He was not a man who trusted entirely to sunboards or the color of the water. He was a man who looked for a fixed point in a turning world. On his journey west from the Norwegian coast, his primary guide at night was a single star. It was a star that was not particularly bright, but was unique in its behavior. While all the other stars in the sky wheeled in great circles throughout the night, this one star remained stubbornly in place. This was Polaris, the North Star. For a Viking sailor, the North Star was the most reliable friend they had on a clear night. It was a steadfast anchor in the heavens. To find it was to find a true and unchanging direction. As long as Floki could see that star, he knew which way was north. From that, he could derive all other directions. South was at his back, east was to his right, and west was to his left. But the North Star was more than just a compass. It was also a tool for measuring latitude, how far north or south you were. Floki, like other experienced navigators, would have known how to measure the star's height above the horizon. He might have done it simply with his hand. By holding his arm outstretched, he could measure the angle in hand spans or fingers. He knew that back in his home fjord in Norway, the North Star sat at a certain height in the sky, a certain number of hand spans above the horizon at night. As he sailed west, he needed to keep that star at the same height. If the star began to sink lower, closer to the horizon, he knew he had drifted too far south. If it rose higher in the sky, he had drifted too far north. This technique of sailing the latitude was fundamental to the settlement of Iceland. The voyage was a long journey due west from ports like Bergen in Norway. Navigators knew that if they could just maintain their home latitude, they would, sooner or later, hit their target. The North Star was the celestial rail that guided them across the empty ocean, so on the deck of his ship, night after night, Floki would watch his star. He would measure its height. He would tell the helmsman to steer a little more to the north or a little more to the south to keep the star where it belonged. It was a simple but effective method of navigation, requiring no complex tools, only a clear eye and a steady hand. It was this star, this unmoving point of light, that guided him across the North Atlantic to the land of ice and fire. He would later lose his livestock in a harsh winter and name the country Iceland in bitterness, but the method that got him there was a testament to the Vikings' practical astronomy. They found the one thing in their world that did not move and used it to cross the moving, shifting, treacherous sea. And number 5, the Road of Whales. The journey from Iceland to Greenland was always a gamble, but Thorhall the Hunter, a man who sailed with Thorfinn Karlsefni on the Vinland expedition around 10 AD, knew secrets others did not. He was not a man who spent his time looking at the sky, he looked at the water, he was a student of the ocean's great beasts. The sagas describe a specific term used by Viking sailors, havalreki, which means whale drive or whale road. It was more than just a poetic phrase, it was a practical navigational aid. The Vikings had observed that certain species of whales followed specific migration routes at specific times of the year. These routes were like seasonal highways across the ocean. Thorhall knew that in the late spring and early summer, great whales, likely humpbacks and fin whales, migrated from their winter breeding grounds in warmer waters north to their summer feeding grounds in the nutrient-rich waters between Iceland and Greenland. They were following the food, the vast blooms of plankton and krill that flourished in the cold northern currents. As their ship sailed west from Iceland, Thorhall was constantly scanning the horizon not for land, but for the blow of a whale. The crew thought he was just looking for a chance to hunt, but he was doing something far more important. "The whales know the way," he told a young crewman. "They do not need a sunstone. Their bellies are their compass. They follow the cold water where the food is rich. The path to the Greenlandic feeding grounds is a deep, cold current. If we find the whales, we find the current. If we find the current, we find the land." For 2 days, they saw nothing. The sea was empty. The crew grew anxious, but on the 3rd day, a lookout shouted. A plume of mist had shot into the air, far to the north of them. Then another. It was a pod of whales moving steadily west. "Steer for them," Thorhall ordered. "Do not chase them, follow them, keep them in sight." For the next day and a half, their ship shadowed the pod of great whales. The animals were not moving in a perfectly straight line, but in a generally westward direction. Thorhall knew they were following the contours of the undersea landscape and the currents that concentrated their food. They were, in effect, acting as living guides. This method was based on a profound ecological knowledge. It required an understanding of animal behavior, oceanography, and the seasonal cycles of the natural world. And a navigator like Thorhall was also a biologist. He knew which whales migrated, when they migrated, and where they were going. He knew that following a pod of dolphins might be useless as they roamed widely, but the great baleen whales were creatures of habit, their lives tied to a strict annual timetable and geography. As they followed the whales, Thorhall also noticed a change in the water. It became colder. The color shifted slightly. They were entering the East Greenland Current, the very road the whales were traveling. A day later, they saw the first towering icebergs, and soon after, the high, dark mountains of the Greenland coast. They had successfully crossed the Denmark Strait by following the ancient, invisible path laid out for them by the giants of the deep. Thorhall the Hunter had shown that sometimes the best way to navigate was to let the local wildlife lead the way. Number 4. The birds that know the way home. Floki Vilgerdarsson, the man who used the North Star to find Iceland, had another trick as well. The Landnámabók gives him another name, Hrafna Floki, which means Raven Floki. The name came from the method he used to make his final landfall. He did not trust his dead reckoning entirely. He wanted confirmation, so he brought along some special navigational instruments, 3 ravens, after sailing west from the Faroe Islands for what he judged to be a sufficient time. He decided to test his position. He released the first raven. The bird flew high into the air, circled the ship once, and then flew straight back in the direction they had come, toward the Faroes. Floki knew then that land was closer behind him than ahead. He ordered the crew to sail on. A day or 2 later, he released the second raven. This one also flew high, circled the ship, but seemed uncertain. It flew a short distance one way, then another, and eventually it came back and landed on the ship's mast, unwilling to commit to a direction. To Floki, this meant they were now so far from any land that the bird could not see or sense it. They were truly in the middle of the ocean. He sailed on, holding his westward course. Finally, after another day of sailing, he released the third and final raven. This bird soared into the sky, circled, and then flew with powerful, determined wing beats directly to the west. It did not hesitate, it did not return, it flew as if it had a destination in mind. Floki knew what this meant. The raven, with its superior eyesight from high altitude, had spotted land that was still invisible to the men on the ship. "Steer after the raven," Floki commanded. "He will show us the way." They followed the direction the raven had taken. Hours later, the lookout in the high post shouted, "Land!" A dark line of mountains on the horizon. The raven had led them directly to Iceland. This was a brilliant and practical technique. It was a form of biological reconnaissance. The Vikings understood the behavior of certain birds. Ravens are intelligent and have excellent vision. They are also land-based birds and prefer not to spend the night at sea. If released, a raven's instinct would be to fly toward the nearest landmass. This method was likely used by many Norse navigators, not just Floki. They would have used other birds as well. Observing the flight paths of gannets, guillemots, or puffins was also a key skill. The seabirds nest on land and feed at sea. If you saw them flying out in the morning, you knew land was in the direction they came from. If you saw them in the late afternoon flying purposefully in a single direction, they were heading home to their nests for the night. Following them was a sure way to find their rookery and thus land. The use of land-finding birds was a low-tech but highly effective way to solve the final, crucial problem of a long sea voyage making accurate landfall. Floki's ravens were not just passengers, they were an essential part of his navigational toolkit, a living compass that could see over the horizon. Number 3, the sunboard's shadow. The Unartok disk, found in Greenland, was a sun compass, but the sagas speak of another, related tool, the solar board or sunboard. While the Unartok disk was likely used for finding a true north-south line, the sunboard may have been a more complex device used for maintaining a specific bearing. A young navigator named Eric, learning his trade on a voyage to Iceland in 930 AD, would have been taught its use. His master, an old sailor named Ulf, would have shown him the tool. It was a simple wooden disc floating in a bucket of water to keep it level. In the center was a vertical pin, a gnomon. Around the edge were a series of marks. The sun is a good guide, Ulf would have explained, but it is a tricky one. It does not stay still. If you steer to keep the sun on your left in the morning, you will be going east, but if you keep it on your left in the afternoon, you will be going west. You must account for its movement. The sunboard was the tool for this. At the start of their journey from Norway, Ulf would have made a mark on the board. He would have waited until they were on their desired course due west. Then he would have marked the exact spot where the tip of the gnomon's shadow fell at that moment. Perhaps it was mid-morning. Now, Ulf would have said to Eric, our job all day is to keep the shadow's tip on this line. As the sun moved across the sky, the shadow cast by the pin would move as well. To keep the shadow's tip on the pre-drawn line, Eric would have to constantly, subtly adjust the ship's course. The line on the board was a pre-calculated curve, likely drawn from experience. It represented the path the shadow should follow throughout the day if the ship stayed on a constant bearing. This was a more sophisticated technique than simply pointing toward the sun. It transformed the sun from a simple direction finder into part of a dynamic guidance system. It allowed a navigator to hold a precise course, not just general east or west throughout the day, as long as the sun was visible. The biggest challenge was knowing what the curve of the shadow's path should be. This would change depending on the season and the latitude. A navigator like Ulf would have had a collection of these boards, or perhaps one board with multiple lines carved on it for different times of year and different journeys. This knowledge was the real secret, passed down from master to apprentice. For young Eric, the day would have been a constant dance between the sun, the shadow, and the steering oar. He would watch the shadow creep away from the line and call out a correction to the helmsman. A little to port, bring the shadow back. And it required constant attention, but it allowed for a level of accuracy in open water navigation that was remarkable for its time. It was a way of using the sun's predictable movement as the gear train for a navigational machine. It was not a point-and-shoot method, it was a system of continuous course correction, all guided by a simple shadow falling on a piece of wood. Number 2, the magical stone that finds the sun. The sky was white. Not cloudy white, but a flat, uniform, luminous white that hurt the eyes. They were in the North Atlantic, somewhere between Iceland and Norway, in the summer of 999 AD. The high, thin cloud cover of a weather front had moved in, completely obscuring the sun. You could not see the disk of the sun, or even a bright spot where it might be. The whole sky was the light source. For a Viking navigator, this was one of the worst conditions. Without the sun, finding a direction was nearly impossible. The wind was fickle, the sea was calm, offering no swell, they were sailing blind. The ship, captained by a Christian convert named Olaf Tryggvason, according to one saga, was effectively lost. And then a man named Sigurd came forward. He was a quiet man, a pagan who held to the old ways. He held a small crystalline stone in his hand. It was clear and sharp-edged, a piece of Iceland spar, a form of calcite. The other sailors watched, some with skepticism, some with awe. They called it a solarstein, a sunstone. Sigurd held the stone up to the sky. He did not look through it. He looked at it, he slowly rotated the stone in his fingers, watching the light that passed through it. The king asked Sigurd to tell where the sun was, the saga of King Olaf says. He took the sunstone and held it up and saw where light radiated from the stone and thus verified the king's prediction. The science behind this magic is polarization. Light from the sun travels in waves that vibrate in all directions. When it passes through the Earth's atmosphere, it becomes polarized. It tends to vibrate more in one direction than others. The pattern of this polarization is directly related to the position of the sun. Even when the sun is hidden by clouds or fog, or even when it is just below the horizon, this pattern of polarized light remains in the sky. The Iceland spar crystal has a unique property called birefringence. It splits a single ray of light into two. When you look through it, you see a double image. As you rotate the stone, these two images change in brightness. When you are pointed toward the sun, there is a specific orientation of the stone where the two images become equally bright. The Sigurd was not looking for an image of the sun. He was looking for this point of equal brightness. He rotated the stone, scanning it across the arc of the white sky where he believed the sun to be. He watched the light inside the crystal shift and change. Then he stopped. He had found it. The one spot in the sky from which the light, when passed through his stone, produced a balanced, equal glow. There, he said, pointing to a section of the blank white sky. The sun is there. Using that bearing, Olaf was able to correct his course. The sunstone had allowed them to find the sun's position with uncanny accuracy, even when it was completely invisible to the naked eye. It was a remarkable piece of technology, using a deep, intuitive understanding of optics to solve a fundamental problem of navigation. It was the closest thing the Vikings had to a magic wand, a small piece of the earth that could reveal the secrets of the sky. Number 1, the sun itself is the compass. Before all the other tools, before the sunstones and the bearing dials, there was just the sun. The most fundamental, most important navigational tool the Vikings possessed was a deep and practical understanding of the sun's daily and seasonal journey across the sky. Consider a young man named Bjarni Herjolfsson. In 986 AD, the sagas say, he was sailing from Iceland to join his father in the new colony in Greenland. He was a merchant, not an explorer, but he was about to make a historic mistake. A storm blew him off course. For many days, he and his crew saw nothing but fog and gray sky. When the sun finally reappeared, Bjarni was utterly lost. He had no idea where he was, he had no magical sunstone, no flock of ravens. What he had was a basic core knowledge shared by every Norse seaman. He knew that in the summer in the North Atlantic, the sun rose in the northeast, traveled across the southern part of the sky during the day, and set in the northwest. He looked at the sun, it was mid-morning, and it was off his port bow. He knew, therefore, that he was generally heading south or southwest. This was the wrong direction. Greenland was to the west. He needed the morning sun to be behind him, not in front of him. Turn the ship, he would have ordered. Put the sun on the stern. This was the simplest form of sun navigation. It was not precise, it did not give a specific bearing, but it provided the 4 cardinal directions. At any time of day, a Viking navigator could get a rough idea of his heading just by looking at the sun's position. He knew its arc. He knew that at midday, when it was at its highest point in the sky, it was due south. The shadow cast by the mast at that moment would point due north. This was the most reliable way to find a north-south line. Bjarni turned his ship and sailed west for 2 days. He sighted land, but it was not the mountainous, glacier-covered landscape of Greenland he had been told about. It was low, flat, and forested. He knew it was not Greenland, so he did not go ashore. He had, by sheer accident, become the first European to see North America. He turned his ship again, using the sun to guide him north. He sailed for several more days, keeping the midday sun to his left. He sighted more land, but it still did not match the description of Greenland. Finally, after turning east again, he found the familiar coast of the Norse settlement. His entire journey, after being lost in the storm, was a masterclass in basic fundamental sun compass navigation. He used the sun to determine his direction, to correct his course, and to systematically search for his destination. He didn't need a carved wooden disc. The sky itself was his compass rose. The sun was the needle. This fundamental knowledge was the bedrock upon which all other Viking navigational techniques were built. The ability to read the sun's position and movement was the first and most important skill. It was what allowed them to leave the coast behind and venture into the open ocean. Bjarni's accidental discovery was a failure as a voyage to Greenland, but it was a stunning testament to the power of these simple, ancient techniques. Lost in the middle of a vast, unknown ocean, he was able to find his way, discover a new continent, and then find his way back, all by using the reliable, predictable, and ever-present clockwork of the sun.